I started off my last Flash review talking about how the episode beforehand, The Good, the Bad, and the Lucky, had broken the record for the lowest rated episode of The Flash ever on IMDb by far. Well, now I'm starting off this review for this episode to say that last week's episode, Wildest Dreams, is now tied for the second lowest rated episode of the show ever and will no doubt go lower to actual second lowest rated episode, and it's tied with what was the previous lowest rated episode of the show before The Good, the Bad, and the Lucky. The two lowest rated episodes of the show aired in a row, which is so sad. Again, I'm not sure I'd say it was the actual second worst episode ever, but I understand its rating considering its placement in the show's last season and its general irrelevance. This video is a review of the third filler episode in a row, which also doesn't feature the Flash at all, or at the very least not in costume, that being The Flash Season 9 Episode 8, Partners in Time. This episode does focus on Barry and Iris, which definitely already makes it better than the previous two. It is kind of ridiculous that I have to even say that an episode of The Flash that focuses on The Flash is better than one that doesn't, but that's where we are right now with this show. Except this episode barely even focuses on The Flash, since Barry never actually suits up, unless you count his Star Trek suit, which I am not, making this the third episode in a row which is filler but also doesn't feature The Flash, at least not fully, thus making basically an entire quarter of the final season of The Flash not even feature The Flash. It's absolutely dumbfounding. This episode certainly doesn't have it as bad when it comes to the lack of The Flash due to Barry taking the leading role and even using his speed a few times, all of which we wouldn't even notice normally. If this was just a regular episode of Season 7 where Barry does use his speed but doesn't suit up, we wouldn't even notice it, but this is the third episode in a row, which certainly amplifies it to the point where, again, it's dumbfounding how this happened. Barry and Iris' plot in this episode is certainly very derivative at this point. It's basically the same exact thing as episode 1, just with a few changes, and it's the third situation like this that Iris was trapped in this season, and it definitely doesn't help that this was 2 episodes in a row. However, it's much better than the previous episode, for nothing else than the fact that Barry and Iris have way better chemistry than somebody like Iris and Dreamer. In fact, in this episode, Barry and Iris had better chemistry than I think they ever had, or at the very least more than they typically have. It really felt like Grant Gustin and Candice Patton gave it the role in this episode in terms of bouncing off each other, and were helped by the fact that the writing wasn't actually all that bad, despite not having a lot of Barry in the Flash suit, being filler, and being derivative of episode 1. I think it's basically equal in quality for episode 1, as it's partially made up for with better writing, or at the very least, very fun interactions between Barry and Iris. And that was definitely the highlight of the episode for me, as was some of the writing choices for Barry and Iris, in particular making them a bit self-aware, like Iris mentioning the previous 2 situations she was stuck in this season, or Barry mentioning that he should have learned at this point that time traveling won't work, and that he doesn't learn, mentioning the unoriginal plot or Barry's inconsistencies shouldn't excuse those things, but what it did do was make those things feel less like bad writing and more organic, and while it is a temporary trick that doesn't fix the larger problem, and let me tell you, this episode had a lot of the Flash's larger issues, it did give me a bit more perspective into the Flash and Barry Allen and Iris and what they go through. Like, Barry Allen doesn't learn from those things, but is that bad writing, or is that Barry just being flawed? I think it's mostly bad writing, but for this particular episode, it did give me a bit perspective, and I kind of appreciated that. I do appreciate the episode having an actual comic book villain in Lady Kronos. She, like regular Kronos, is primarily an enemy of the Atom, and has been in stories of other heroes as well. She wasn't exactly a great villain though, she mostly came off as pretty stupid and incompetent, but at this point, a comic book villain with their comic book design acting like a 2-dimensional cartoon villain is basically the best we can ask for. Just look at the Red Death arc. Even if she isn't involved in any fight scenes, and there aren't actually any fight scenes at all in this episode, because again, Barry never suits up as the Flash. I think my overall opinion on that part of the episode is relatively neutral. It's basically the same as episode 1, just with some improvements, like better writing, more fun interactions, and a better overall vibe that comes off as honestly pretty fun to watch. But it's also worse in the fact that it's filler, it lacks the Flash for the third episode in a row, and just the fact that they had the same episode earlier in the season gives that first episode an advantage. This episode is very derivative. derivative. What this makes is an episode of basically equal quality to episode 1, which is an episode I gave a 5 out of 10 to, but that's a rating for the entire episode, not just the main plot. The main plots are equal, but let's look at the side storylines, which this episode had a pretty terrible one. I'm pretty sure you already know what I'm going to say about this. Chester and Allegra have their own story this episode, which is nothing more than an automatic rating lowering of the episode because nobody cares. It's the classic boyfriend says I love you too early story, which is very cliche, made worse by the lack of emotional connection with the couple in question, because again, nobody cares, man. I mean, this episode literally tells us through Barry that Team Flash has the day off. How come when Barry and Iris got the day off, they went on a vacation and they didn't appear in the episode, but with Chester and Allegra, they get their own storyline in Cecile's house playing board games? Who's the main character here? What are you doing, Eric? How do you not realize that literally there isn't a soul on Earth that cares about any of this? And let me tell you, Cecile's presence definitely doesn't help either. She uses her powers only once this episode, which is already too many, but at least it's only once. That being said, it was such a terrible moment, completely invading the emotional privacy of Allegra and Chester, and at some point, surely these people will tell Cecile how disturbing it is that she could always tell how everyone is feeling. They have no privacy in terms of how they're feeling. It's disturbing. It was in this moment specifically that it really hit me how wrong it is, how this is just a normal part of these people's lives, and they never question it. Yeah, this part of the episode is trash. This whole storyline is definitely really bad, and while the main plot of the episode is basically equal to the likes of episode 1, despite how derivative it is, it's the side storyline where the episode becomes worse. Fortunately, Chillblaine doesn't appear in the episode at all, and the Keon appears ever so briefly. Unfortunately, Keon's 2 scenes are so bad that they definitely leave a mark. It's all about how Keon is going to meet Caitlin's mom. Keon's nervous, but Barry reassures her that Carla probably just wants to meet her and get to know her, and it turns out he's right, which just rubs me the wrong way. It's another step in the complete and utter lack of respect for the life of Caitlin Snow. Nobody cared about her death, and now they're bringing her mother into this. You're gonna tell me that all she really cared about was getting to know Keon, and that's portrayed as a good thing? Why does she not care about her daughter? Why does absolutely nobody care that Caitlin died? Some new being took over her body, and that being is very weird, and they have the ability to bring Caitlin back, and they just don't care. It's all so unfathomably absurd that even when it's just in 2 scenes in 1 episode, it brings down that episode at the very least 1 point in the rating system. Barry and Iris' plot could definitely be fun at times, but this might be the single worst episode of the season when it comes to the flashbacks issue, an issue that I've mentioned in a lot of previous reviews. If you haven't seen my previous reviews, the flashbacks issue is where in this season, basically every time the show would mention or reference an event from a previous season or even a previous episode in this season, there would be a flashback showing that scene on screen. A flashback here or there is fine, but the constant flashing back shows a lack of confidence from the creators of this show in the show's memorability, or also a lack of confidence in the intelligence of the show's viewers, which leads to the audience being both insulted and dismayed from watching the show. This episode goes hard with the flashbacks. They pop up a lot, and it is a strong issue for this episode. In conclusion, the episode is certainly a lot better than the previous 2 just because it actually focuses on the main characters, Barry and Iris, who are so clearly and utterly better than everyone else, it's ridiculous. Barry and Iris have some very fun interactions with each other and the curators. The writing is definitely not as bad as the show can be, and the idea of the episode is fun, but it's too similar to other episodes of this season. It's the 3rd episode in a row to both not feature the Flash and be filler, and then the episode is definitely brought down a lot by its side storyline about Chester and Allegra, which ranges between irrelevant and actively annoying, as well as the 2 scenes that include Keon, which are trash. I feel very similarly about this episode as I did about episode 1. I think some aspects are a bit worse, some aspects are a bit better, and you put that together and you get basically the same score, which is a 5 out of 10, mediocre, which actually brings the average of the season so far to a 4.125 out of 10, which is embarrassing, but maybe, hopefully, the next episode, which features Green Arrow, Bloodwork, Diggle, and Kid Flash, and, surprisingly, Barry Allen will suit up as the Flash. Maybe that episode can up the abysmal average of this season a bit. please be good. If any episode is going to be good, it'd be that one and the series finale that definitely need to be. I'm just really hoping for a fun crossover episode next, not week, next episode. It comes out in 20 days. But that's it for my review of The Flash Season 9 Episode 8. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and if you like this video, make sure to subscribbly dibble and goodbye.